Welcome to Mindset Mondays. Hi, I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc, and we're here today to explore some very interesting topics relevant to what's going on in our world today. And, the whole idea behind Mindset Mondays is to expose you to some new ways of thinking, some insights of what's happening out there from subject matter experts. And so today I'm delighted to have with me Neil Gordon with the Silver Bullet. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much for having me, Debra.
Yes. Well, I met Neil, I can't even remember, through some online stuff and got to know you a little bit and following your work and participating in it. And it's been a real delight. And I know, as you talked about on Facebook a couple of weeks ago or a week ago, you had a whole mindset about what you were going to do and send out to your followers, and then everything happened. And so it has really shifted. And I know I've struggled to think about, what do I want to say and what can I say that other people haven't already said? But, it's so share a little bit about that, Neil.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was something that threw many of us, if not all of us, for a loop. Mm-hmm. And that, to put a little context around the timeline here, the very unfortunate things that happened around George Floyd's death took place on a Monday. And then by that following weekend, there were not only protests, but there was also looting going on. I live in Santa Monica, California, which is usually a very tidy and orderly beach community. And the downtown retail area was completely looted, with windows shattered and items stolen. I myself had helicopters flying overhead for probably about 30 to 36 hours. Wow. And it was pretty jarring on the system. And the protesters, they walked by a few blocks from my apartment. I had gone for a walk at one point, and it's like, this actually isn't a smart place to be right now. I need to go home. And I did. And sure enough, that it wasn't long after that the looting started to happen and everything. And so this all happened over the weekend. And then that Monday, I had scheduled to plan to do this before even George Floyd's death took place. Mm-hmm. I had intended on emailing my list about a quiz I just put together on helping with one's elevator pitch. Mm-hmm. And how do you present yourself in a compelling way in just a few seconds. And by Sunday night, I'm like, no, that's a terrible idea. This is completely tone deaf. It's arguably inappropriate to be writing people about an elevator pitch right on the heels of helicopters and looting and everything. Mm-hmm. But I also didn't want to just hide away. I wanted to show up for my people, for my list, for the people who follow me. And I was at a loss as to what to say. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that not only was not a problem, it was arguably the most important thing for me to stew in and share. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't just write my list and say, I'm at a loss as to what to say. I wrote my list that Monday, the day after this whole terrible weekend happened, and said, I was supposed to send you guys a quiz today, but that doesn't seem appropriate. But I'm also not exactly sure how to show up for you. I'm not sure what would help you the most right now. I could still send you that quiz, or we could do a Facebook Live together, or I could send emails as usual because you just need the distraction, or maybe there's something else I haven't mentioned. Which of these things would benefit you most? Mm-hmm. And so instead of just telling everyone like XYZ about what we need to do right now or make some kind of declarative statement, mm-hmm. I simply asked. I showed up not with declarations, but curiosity. What is it that all of you would benefit from right now? Mm-hmm. And I didn't just say, fill out a survey or something cold and impersonal like that. I actually said, reply to this email, tell me, and I will reply back. And 36 or 48 hours later, however long it was, I had nearly 200 emails I had responded to.
I was one of them.
And you were one of them. And what amazed me, Debra, is that it wasn't even one of the choices. They didn't say, actually, I mean, some people said, oh, it would be great to do a Facebook Live, which we did. And it would be great to actually look at that quiz. That sounds like a nice distraction, which I sent that to the individuals who asked for it and all of that, and a few other things as well. It's like, I could use some help marketing a book. I mean, it ran the gamut kind of thing. But mostly people just wrote back wanting to share their thoughts. Mostly people just wrote back saying, this is what we need to do, or this is how I feel about what's going on, or this is what I'm struggling with, or whatever it is. And I realized that a solution wasn't nearly like any solution I could provide wasn't nearly as important on that day, that week, as helping my followers to simply feel seen and heard. And you're right that I absolutely wrote them all back. Because how seen or heard would they feel if they wrote an email, sent it off into the ether, and never heard anything back?
Yeah.
And so the important thing there was for my people to feel seen and heard, especially if they had a lot of fears about the color of their skin or something like that.
Right, right. Well, I think, I mean, I know I was really touched and moved by that whole email because, I mean, it's so indicative of what people out there are feeling. I mean, that's why, they're out there protesting because they don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, they don't feel listened to, they don't feel protected, they don't feel safe. And I know for myself, I've always worked in the world of diversity and inclusion. And I have to say, I was so dismayed to see that there's still so much injustice going on. I mean, I knew that there was, but to the degree that it has been, is just sort of overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can feel overwhelming. And that's the exact recipe for someone holding space for them in that overwhelm and just reflecting enough back to know that they are not completely alone in this world. And that automatically will take our system down from overwhelm to, this is really awful, but I'm dealing with it.
Yeah.
And that can make all the difference for a lot of us.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that raises important questions. I know we still have a long way to go in navigating through, what's going on, and unfortunately things keep happening. So, but I guess, when we think, concurrently with all of this, and, with COVID-19 and businesses starting to reopen, and yet, infections are still going up. And so, what message do you have for leaders then, as we talk about trying to, face this new world of doing things, and as we face getting back to the workplace, what can you suggest for how leaders can show up?
I would say, based on what I have seen that I don't feel is effective, and what I've seen that is effective, and what I've done myself, not just when this happened, but in how I aspire at least to show up in the world, even if I'm not 100% perfect at doing so. What I feel the most valuable thing actually plays into the themes that came up that I was just talking about, the one-to-many communication to my email list, and just asking what they feel would support them most right now. What I found that a leader can do in terms of their mindset and how they can show up is to similarly show up from a place of curiosity rather than judgment when it comes to finding their voice. Because I feel the most harmful thing that's going to keep the problems that we're facing now as big of a problem, like the thing that's going to keep these problems from being solved ultimately, is further polarization, further us versus you, us versus them kind of thing. And there was one person, a celebrity actually, who posted something. I got to memorize this, Debra, because I refer to it a lot in my conversations now, because it's such an important example of what I feel is not helping us right now. There was a celebrity who posted something on Facebook or Instagram or something like that, that was basically saying that, calling out the apparent racists, the conservatives, the people who are living in red states and stuff like that, and saying, it's basically like, you are a racist because you didn't vote for Obama and it's kind of thing, like it was like a much more clever thing than I'm actually articulating now. It was a very clever turn of phrase saying that you're racist because of your hate of that, and we hate you because you're racist, and it was just like a lot of vitriol in the thing. Again, it was very clever, and it got lots of shares, lots of likes, lots of comments, and all of that. And it was the progressive movement calling out the more conservative movement for being racist.
Mm.
And I don't feel, however clever the turn of phrase was, I don't actually feel that it helps us move forward.
Mm-hmm.
We dig our, if we dig our heels in and say we're right and someone else is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
then that is ultimately going to just keep us where we are.
Yeah.
Because the people who we call racist and who we call wrong kind of thing are now right now in a state of fear, possibly, or anger or self-righteousness, and they're going to dig their heels in more. But if we instead, so we're basically judging them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we instead flip our script, flip our mindset to say, let's not go into this with judgment, but
Mm-hmm.
rather curiosity, no matter how much we disagree, no matter how convinced we are that we're right and they're wrong, if we instead of saying, how can you think that? Or how can you say that? We simply say, what is it you feel when you say that? Or what do you feel has inspired you to feel this way? Or can you tell me more about that? Is possibly the simplest, most foolproof way. Can you tell me more about that? And all of that. I mean, the tone is arguably even more important than the actual words.
Yeah.
But the amount of additional conflict we're having, that people who feel they're right and the other people are wrong, and making other people feel bad about being wrong, the amount that that's exacerbating the problem frustrates me a great deal.
Yeah.
But if I met one of them and said, how could you say such a vitriolic thing in your Instagram? That wouldn't help either. I was like, oh, I saw that you posted that. How do you feel? What would you say inspired you to post that? Or whatever it is. It would still be on me to not be judgmental of them. Even though talking to you, I'm saying that's not a good thing. If I talk to them, I wouldn't say, how could you do that? I would say, tell me more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what you're saying and how you're saying it reminds me of Stephen Covey's seek first to understand before you seek to be understood.
Yeah.
Because too often we just launch right into things and blah, 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 giving our own perspective and not finding out where the other person's coming from. And yet we're all part of the human race. We're all part of the human race.
We all want to feel seen and heard, Deborah.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's been an interesting dynamic unfold here. So what do you think as maybe what's the biggest mistake that you see leaders making when it comes to influencing or persuading, leading people?
Yeah, of course. This gets into a slightly different conversation when it's more in the realm of when a leader is putting together some kind of messaging, some kind of content, whether it's maybe a CEO writing to their company during times of strain and stress and adversity and conflict, or it's somebody getting up in front of others and speaking, someone giving a virtual presentation. What these various leaders and those who seek to impact the world around them all have in common is that they're looking to persuade others of an idea. And this act of persuasion is expressed in many ways, like the ways I just explained. It could be as simple as writing an article or an editorial or something like that. And generally, that person has an idea that they want to get out into the world and somehow impact others. And to your question, a mistake that so many of them make in persuading others of the viability of their idea is that they believe that information is the most important asset. That if they provide a lot of facts and figures, if they're looking to teach people how to do something, if they provide their construct, their steps, if they have an acronym that's 5 or 7 letters long. They might make all of their content about getting as much of that information across as possible. They only have 30 minutes. Well, I better pack in my whole thing in that 30 minutes. And what the basic assumption, the basic mistake is, the more information they provide, the more impactful they will be. This, however, is the information age.
Yeah.
I have my phone right here, actually. We have access to as much information as we could ever want in our pockets.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't actually need information to start a movement. I actually misspeak there. We don't need to make information the only thing necessary to start a movement. That's not actually the basis of how someone is so persuasive that they just reach this critical mass where everyone is doing things, or a lot of people are doing things differently. And so when we look at this, we could look at the story of the little engine that could. This is a very favorite reference that I like to make, in that the first train is too busy. The train breaks down, right? And the first train engine is too busy and doesn't have the time. So he doesn't take the train over the mountain. And the second train is too old and tired. And so he doesn't take the train over the mountain. And the little engine comes along. She says, yes, I'll take the train over the mountain. And she goes over. She says, I think I can. I think I can. And she makes it over. The first train was too busy. The second train was too old and tired. And yet the third train engine, the little engine, made it over. She was empowered in the way that the other engines were not, but not because she had more information. The difference in her as opposed to the others is that she believed that she could make it over, whereas the other two did not. Mm-hmm. And so the mistake that leaders are making is that they're going to empower others, they're going to influence others, they're going to persuade others with information. But really, the shift is in how you can incite a different belief.
So it's really reaching out to appeal to their emotions. And, you know, what I'm hearing out of the little engine story is that she had hope and optimism,
right?
And therefore in excitement and challenge.
Right. She had optimism and hope, to what you just said, to reach a different outcome than was previously being achieved. Yeah. Instead of having a broken down train, you have one that's thriving on the other side of the mountain, delivering all the candy and toys to the girls and boys, right? Mm-hmm. And so if somebody shows up and they're hearing from a leader, the most powerful thing that a person can experience in response to what that leader says or does is this hope that change is possible. Right. Because that's what incites further action. Yeah. So if you have 30 minutes, you want your followers, you want your audience to take further action, more so than just feel good in the moment. Right. The other thing I heard in what you were saying is that, you know, because there was a vision of the children on the other side, and then it was a purpose of serving others. Mm. So the train rose up to that challenge of doing good. Yeah, absolutely. And what you highlight there, Debra, is a point that I do like to make to my folks, is that the value of your message is not based on what you say, but rather what your audience does once you're done saying it. Yeah. And so if we think in the story about the little girls and boys enjoying all of the great things that the train brought over, it's not ultimately about what you say or do. It's ultimately what your audience does on the other side of your saying and doing the things you do as a leader. Right. Yeah. So it is about that vision. So what would you say is the key then to influencing others in ways that motivate them to take action with what you've said? Well, I do like to say that the only hard and fast rule of communication is that there are no hard and fast rules. I've read that in your writing before. Yeah. It's a very famous thing among my followers now, because I say it all the time, because as much as I can show up and talk to you about best communication practices, something that completely departs from what I say could be just as effective. And so I would be loath to come off or in any way leave the impression that there's only one way to do this, right? That being said, There is one particular technique that I'm very much a fan of teaching people about, because it's not only incredibly effective, it's also incredibly overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're reading like a book, I read books on my Kindle, right? I'm one of those who's gone from paper books to electronic books. And what I noticed years ago, and has continued to be a trend, is how when you're reading a book on a Kindle, there are certain passages that often get highlighted by those who read it. And because of the big Kindle network,
Mm-hmm.
the software aggregates when readers highlight certain passages.
Oh, wow. I didn't know.
So you might see like a certain sentence that's highlighted hundreds of times, or depending on how valuable, or I'm sorry, not how popular the book is, thousands of times.
Yeah.
And there's one book in particular that I love, and one of his sentences, as of looking at it a couple of weeks ago, was highlighted 29,000 times.
Wow.
I mean, just think about what it is to sell 29,000 copies of your book in any format,
Ooh.
let alone selling the electronic version, let alone people taking the time
Yeah.
to highlight a certain passage 29,000 times. And so what's really quite wonderful, Deborah, is that not all of them, but many of these sentences that get highlighted so many thousands of times all follow a certain pattern.
Hmm.
There's a certain kind of sentence that's been showing up for thousands of years, since the days of Sun Tzu and Aristotle. If you go into Brainy Quote and you look up Aristotle's most popular quotes, probably about 40–50% of his most popular quotes follow this pattern as well. So again and again, we see quantifiable demonstration that this one pattern shows up as being this one kind of sentence that empowers people, leads to people having aha moments,
Mm-hmm.
getting a dopamine rush and saying, oh, I'm going to highlight that. That was good. And we can use it in our elevator pitches and in our speeches and our TED Talks and on and on and on.
So isn't that what you call a silver bullet?
This is what I call a silver bullet. So
Very,
everyone knows, Debra knows a little bit about my work by this point. This
yes,
is a
I do.
silver
Well,
bullet.
and I want to go ahead and just sort of segue a moment, and we'll come back to what we were talking about. But, I do know a little bit about your background. And so I'd like to have you sort of, well, people love a story, right? And so people love to hear someone's story about how they got to where they are. And so, what was a little bit about your story?
My story.
Mm-hmm.
My story, depending on how far back we want to go.
Well, we only have so much time, right?
Well, I was born 8 pounds, 6 ounces. No. I'll start it in 2 different places. I'll start it with my background in book publishing. I was a entry-level editor at Penguin before they merged with Random House, and was working with New York Times bestselling authors and all of that. And that's where I got my start working on content professionally. However, what I like to reference is the fact that I might have been somewhat pedigree in working with New York Times bestselling authors and all of that, even albeit at an entry level. And when you hear that, you might think, hey, this is a guy who probably went to some fancy college as an English literature major and always had his head in a book his whole childhood and stuff. And I was completely opposite of that.
Oh, wow.
I hated reading. From the point my dad would tell me that when I got my first book report in 2nd grade, and as soon as reading became work, I hated it. And I read 1 book for leisure between the ages of 8 and 20. And then I picked up reading in my early 20s, and when I moved to New York and all of that, and that got me on the path. But I went from having a 99th percentile reading comprehension in 1st grade to the first time I took the SATs in high school, my sophomore year, I got a 330 verbal score, which put me in the 5th percentile. So I went from 99th to the 5th because my brain turned to mush because I hated reading so much.
Wow.
But then when, as I said, in my early 20s, I picked it up, and certain books just so blew my mind that I had to figure out what was it about the written word and communication in general that could have such a profound impact on me.
Yeah.
And that just led to everything else. It just led to a completely different change in how I related to communication. And it got me the job after a couple of years of analyzing it on my own. I got the job at Penguin. And I left that after a few years and just continued to analyze as much as I could about the written word.
Yeah.
And that got me to things like the Silver Bullet Insight and insights around storytelling and everything else that I teach people now.
That's great. That's fascinating. So I do a lot of public speaking too, and one thing I always like to share with people is that if you want to get really really good at something, the American Library Association suggests that if you write a book on your topic or your field of interest, a book every week for a year, you would be a subject matter expert.
Right.
Yeah, and are you familiar with the work of Dr. John DeMartini?
I actually don't know that work in particular. No.
Oh, okay. Well, sort of similar to you, although a different story leading up to it. But I think he had a maybe dyslexic or some kind of reading disorder, and it was in his early 20s then that he met some very influential people, and just turned his world around. But anytime he wants to learn something, he goes reads about it, and then he speaks on it. He's written over like 40 some books, if not more, in the course of his lifetime. And he's just a fascinating speaker and just very learned and articulate. And I mean, he dives in, and it's great. So you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is gratifying to hear that story, and that there were people who were able to show up for him to help usher him out of the more compromised way that he was relating to language and whatnot. And I also like to emphasize that these days we have the ability to do audiobooks, and you can listen to them at advanced speed and whatnot. And so consuming books can really happen. Getting the information can happen in a variety of ways now that it couldn't necessarily do some time ago. And so there is that possibility. If you have a nonfiction book that's like 8 hours long at regular speed, you listen to it in 4 hours, and you could really concentrate your learning in a short amount of time.
Yep. I was just working with a client earlier today, and I'm going to bring it back sort of to our topic that we were talking about before, as far as some of the unknown going out there, and she literally said, I a whole lot has happened to her in this last week that unrelated to everything else, but there's just so many unknowns, and I'm fearful of all the unknowns. And I said, let's reframe that, because the unknown is simply unknown. What do we need to do now to make it known? And so that's where taking small steps and taking action can turn that around and remove the fear out of it. Because I like Zig Ziglar's words, fear is nothing more than false evidence appearing real. It's what you think is going to happen, or don't know what's going to happen. So if we make that known, now we can remove the fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with a shift out of that fear-based state, it hasn't necessarily solved our problem yet, but we're at the very least ready to solve it.
Yeah.
And it also helps us, when in the process of solving our problems, to do so with far greater effectiveness, at least in my own experience.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that I oftentimes say this, but I've heard it repeated in other people's writings, and as I've heard people speak, is recognize what you do control and let go of what you can't. And so not getting caught up with everything that's out there, but if you are concerned about it, then do what you can do in a way that makes sense for you. And I think that's why we're seeing so many people out on the streets, as far as I can't control that, but I can influence it by what I do.
Sure.
Making choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to moving forward, when we talk about influence and persuasion, what are maybe 2 or 3 key things that you would encourage people to show up with?
Well, if we circle back to the silver bullet concept, I built that up quite a lot, and I would very much love for our listeners to have a practical understanding of what that is.
Please.
At a high level, the silver bullet is essentially a 1-sentence recipe for all of your expertise. Or if it's just for a specific article or a certain part of your expertise, just encapsulating the whole of all of that content into a single sentence. The reason why people are highlighting 29,000 times in those ebooks and whatnot is that they have an aha moment. They have a light bulb kind of thing. They get the dopamine rush, the chills down their spine, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And the reason for all of those things happening, like the highlighting and the chills and all of that, is that suddenly they are empowered without the need for any other context. They are suddenly getting something that a moment ago they didn't necessarily get. And the power of that moment builds a great deal of trust,
Yeah.
but not from a false manipulative kind of way, from a place of legitimate empowerment. That you could say a silver bullet, and because it empowers without context, they might not need to hear anything else from the person who said it and still go off and have ideas and ways to solve a problem that they hadn't thought of before. That empowerment is worth so much in today's times.
Yeah.
Because there is so much noise.
Yeah.
The difference between whether someone listens to us or not can be basically made or broken by whether they feel that dopamine rush, that trust that comes from that light bulb moment.
Right.
And so the way we break that down mechanically, we can use a couple of examples, which I imagine will be helpful to make it
Please.
more real for. So one of my favorite examples goes back several thousand years to Sun Tzu's Art of War, where he says all of warfare is deception. Right? And he says, if you want to win a war, deceive your opponent. That's what it comes down to. He takes all of his expertise and distills it down to that one sentence.
Yeah.
That I might have to paraphrase this a little bit. I haven't memorized it quite as precisely, but the one with 29,000 highlights in that book, it's in a book called Sapiens by an Israeli man by the name of Yuval Harari. And he says in the book that, like, he's posing the question, how can masses of people, masses of strangers cooperate with each other? And he says it's the appearance of fiction. Large groups of strangers can cooperate when they believe in a common myth. When you suddenly have everyone believing in the same thing that is not actually intrinsically true, but something like a fiction that we've created ourselves, like money. Money is not something that was born into this world millions of years ago, along with the rocks and the trees and stuff. It was something we invented.
Yes.
We created that myth and we all believe in it, so we're able to cooperate very nicely.
Yeah. That's a good
So
point.
29,000 highlights of just, if you want people, strangers to cooperate, create a common myth. Okay. And then another, like 46 of the 50 most popular TED Talks have a silver bullet. And one of the ones, I mean, there are all sorts of things, but one of the most famous ones is Simon Sinek's talk on the power of why. And it's the most popular TEDx talk of all time, I think, as of this recording at least. And he says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it.
Yeah.
And he says, so if you want people to buy, talk about why instead of what. Right. And so all of these examples, Deborah, they are all, what is it that makes a silver bullet what it is? It's a cause and effect sentence. A single action leads to a single outcome. One action leads to one outcome. If you want people, the outcome is strangers cooperating, and the action is to get them to believe in a common myth. Common myth, action, outcome is large groups of strangers cooperating, right? Or deceive your opponent is the action, winning the war is the outcome. And so the larger takeaway is to distill your life's work down to, or even just a smaller idea, like a little mini lesson in an article, or a little mini lesson that you're sharing, a tip. Distill it down, what action gets us to this outcome? And when you do that, people will suddenly have all they need to have an aha moment. They get the dopamine rush and they trust you.
Okay. So give me an example. What is your silver bullet so our listeners can hear?
At a very, very high level, if we're to look at me and my expertise in communication, I distill everything down to one sentence. That is like the umbrella silver bullet. And that's that effective communication values the recipient over the sender. If you want to be effective in how you communicate with others, create everything that you say and write around how it positively impacts the other. And actually a close cousin of that, it's like a slightly different way of saying a similar thing, is something I said earlier in our conversation, that the value of your message is not based on what you say, but rather what your audience does once you're done saying it.
Yeah.
So it's a similar idea said in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll usually use effective communication values of the recipient over the sender early on in a speech or something I say. And then if I want to really hit people with a more emotionally powerful thing at the end, I might say that second one at the end.
Yeah.
To really send that home, that the importance, so the action in that one is to, well, I like to go backwards from the outcome. The outcome is having a valuable message,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then the action that you take is shaping a message in a way that has an impact on others, to make your message about impact, right? And so that's how it is. And then when I teach silver bullets, that's the big idea. But then silver bullets is like fits under the umbrella as one of the things that I teach within the house of effective communication. And what I use there is that people are empowered, not by that which they know is true, but rather that which they believe is possible, which circles back to the little engine that could thing that we talked about.
Right. Well, this is really powerful, Neil. I mean, I've heard you a number of times, and I keep getting more valuable nuggets from you every time.
Great.
It's in a little bit further. Yeah. And so, I guess when you talked about this checklist before, and so, where might our listeners find that?
I'm sorry, the quiz or
the quiz. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I said
yeah, of
I
course.
meant the quiz. Yeah.
Yeah. So the quiz is I'm building several quizzes right now. The one that people have really responded to is a speaker quiz.
Oh, okay.
If you are a speaker, if you were a leader, that you might want to figure out how to use your personality to really be more persuasive and effective in captivating others and getting them on board with what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And so you can find the quiz. There's like 5 basic types of speakers that we can explore, and personality types and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And one of them talks about agility, because I know that agility is very much an important part of your work and whatnot.
Absolutely.
And so it's neilcanhelp.com, neilcanhelp.com/quiz. Great. And that'll take you to the quiz on finding out which speaker type you are.
Well, that's wonderful. I'll have to go check that out myself, because I was looking to gain and build this even further. What would be an example of maybe some of your more you talked about working with TEDx speakers, and maybe that's it. But what are some examples of some of your success in working with people?
It runs quite a wide gamut, actually. And I appreciate the question. And sometimes it's a matter of TEDx speakers and incorporating their silver bullet into it, and they'll get 5 to 6 times as many views on YouTube as the other people at that same TEDx event who were released on YouTube at the same time. Even ones I worked with, and I said, okay, here's where you put the silver bullet, and they still didn't use the silver bullet, and they didn't get nearly as many views and stuff like that. So that's an example in the TEDx context. I've helped, like one of my clients I've helped, he was an established author, and he'd sold hundreds of thousands of books, and he really wanted to up his game. He wanted to get onto like a bestseller list, and he wanted to get a book deal with a more prominent publisher. He had a dream imprint at Penguin Random House, actually, he wanted to get published with. And so because of not just the silver bullet, but other best practices in creating the book, we not only got him a deal with his dream imprint, but he also made it to the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. Wow. One of the best-selling business books of the week and all of that. And the book continues, as far as I know, continues to sell and whatnot. And so that's very much a nice win in the kind of outcomes. One of my clients goes around the country. Obviously this story is pre-COVID. She would go around the country doing a sell from the stage kind of thing. And she was doing all right with it, but then we gave her a whole 2-hour workshop. She would charge like $20 for like a meetup kind of workshop. They'd pay $20, and she would want to sell them into a high ticket thing. And we made over her entire presentation and then shifted it to having them do a discovery call as the next step. And she would consistently get 60 to 70% of the people booking a discovery call at the end of the workshop, a vast majority.
That's great.
Because we incorporated the silver bullet and people felt as empowered to take next steps as they did. Mm-hmm. And the stories continue on and on and on. I mean, there's no shortage of them, I promise you that. But whether you're selling or, I mean, my own personal stories are like the quiz that I just told you about. It was my first quiz, and the silver bullet wound up being incorporated into the results videos of the 5 different speaker types. And I just did that this year, like just in the last couple of months. And it was so successful that I've now become kind of like the man who taught me about quizzes. I just watched this free 1-hour webinar. And because I understood what I did about content, the quiz was so successful that he now uses it as one of those most prominent examples of how to do a quiz. Like, I mean, it's just like, I was watching a webinar. I was like, oh, I wonder what Ryan has to say about quizzes right now. And I saw myself as an example. I was like, what kind of thing? It was kind of surreal, actually. So that's,
I think I did watch that. I saw that. Yeah.
Oh, you saw that. So yeah. So you like, you know, he has my homepage like on my website, like as a thumbnail and stuff, and it's all green and it stands out because my designer did such a nice job. And so it's just kind of bizarre. It's like one thing after another, the silver bullet winds up just being this amazingly powerful tool for marketing, for sales, for book writing, for giving TEDx talks, one thing after another.
Mm-hmm. So it seemed like that would be a very valuable tool for our leaders to grab onto, right?
I have seen many examples of leaders who have thrived when they have this in their tool belt, among many other tools, of course, as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, there is something there's sort of a cadence. I think you used that word earlier, perhaps, that, mm-hmm. you know, with how that flows, and it just sort of catches you, you know, and the tonal aspect of delivering it also comes across differently. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's even in tone is a very important feature of how I help my speech the clients whom I help to put together speeches. Mm-hmm. A lot of people just kind of amble along in their speeches and they say, oh, here's some information and here's some information and here's some information. But I like to steer people toward more of that building and climax kind of thing. Yeah. Because it's more captivating that way. It really gets people on the edge of their seats. And if you can deliver a legitimate climax, then it builds the kind of trust where you're honoring the buildup and you're feeding them into wanting to go deeper because of that trust. And of course, the silver bullet winds up being that climactic moment. Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. So I guess one final thing, Neil, I'm going to ask you is you know, what's your vision? What do you want to see happen in the world? I have really struggled with the larger tone that's taken shape in not just a divided America, but a divided world. Yeah. And the largest symptom of that, the most dangerous and frightening symptom of that division is what we could call demagoguery, which is essentially, to think of a demagogue, think of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. And how he preyed upon fear to ascend to power. And of course, that ascension led to mass genocide of many millions of people, as well as the loss of many lives in war. Mm-hmm. And a bloody, bloody scar that may take centuries for us to heal from. My vision, to your question, Deborah, yes, is to eradicate demagoguery, because this work is about persuading people. I mean, I like to joke that my work is around persuasion without everyone needing a shower afterwards, feeling sleazy and all of that, through manipulation. But really below the surface of that is persuasion with heart.
Yeah.
Persuading people to empower them rather than to keep them in fear. Because when we keep people in fear, we see the destructive fallout that comes from that.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll share with you, a couple of years ago, I was doing a lot of research around compassion. I do a lot with the neuroscience of how our brain functions. And so of course that work led me to the writings of the Dalai Lama.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of his pieces that became very famous, and I'm sorry, I can't quote where it was, I think it was in New York, but he basically said, compassion is really nothing more than warm-heartedness.
Mm.
And when I read that, I thought, oh gosh, I could feel my heart just, change, because I think compassion is sort of this concept that people go, well, what is that? And how do I get this? And I think people are afraid of giving too much sometimes because they feel like they get sucked out. But if you're just thinking about being warm-hearted, and you're no different than me, I'm no different than you, regardless of where we come from, how we look, we're just all part of the human race, and to have compassion for who we are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that warmth really does become a panacea for solving such a multitude of problems that we're facing right now.
Oh, great. Well, Neil, it's been absolutely delightful to have you with us today. I mean, as I've gotten to know your work, it was just so much a great connection to Leading Consciously Now. And that's what we're here all about, is being, great people like you who have powerful messages, and in your case, a silver bullet that could truly make a difference in how people show up.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, especially to answer that question for the vision at the end, because that's something we need to focus on to keep going at this.
Yep, absolutely. It's like the little train, she had a vision of what was happening on the other side of the mountain, right?
That's absolutely right. And she thought she could, and she actually did.
Yep. So to empowerment we go, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much. This is Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc. Join us again on Mindset Mondays.